Shalom. You know who I am. I'm Brad, and I'm with the Wild Branch Ministry, and I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for watching the God is Smarter Than We Are program, and I'm hoping and praying that some of your young teenagers and so forth are coming and watching these programs as well, since I'm trying to aim them at the youth. And I hope it has been a blessing to you to see that clearly the end is always revealed out of the beginning, and that's where the Father is taking us these days. And I hope as you watch these programs on the Hebrew Roots Network that they will be a blessing into you, and that you will see their practical use in your life, because we just don't want to do a bunch of religious stuff here. What we're saying and doing should make a difference in your life and everything you set your hand to do. So I do pray that you do indeed prosper in everything you set your hand to do, and that you cling to your roots. Thank you for watching again. Shalom.
Hi, I'm Chris Knight with Love for Yeshua Ministries, and thank you for joining us again today as we continue our series on the fruits of the Spirit and what that should look like in our Torah-observant lifestyle. So just to recap for some of you who might be tuning in for the first time on what we're talking about, we start off the series with defining what it means, the difference between the spirit of the Torah and the letter of the Torah, because I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase before. And we looked at the verse from Deuteronomy chapter 8, where Yahweh said that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that departs from the mouth of Yahweh. Now in the Hebrew it's actually saying man lives not by bread, but by everything that comes out from the mouth of Yahweh. And so we asked the question, well, what comes out of his mouth other than words, other than his word? Well, it's his, the breath, the ruach in Hebrew, which we know ruach is the same word for spirit. So that when Yahweh speaks, it's both spirit and word. And so we looked at the difference between the new and the old covenant. We saw that, Paul's taught in Romans chapter 7 that the law, the Torah, is indeed spiritual. It's a spiritual thing. And the rabbis say this as well, that, the Torah is spiritual. The commandments are the physical manifestation of the Torah in our lives in the physical world. And so when we looked at the difference between the old and the new covenant, we saw that at the base of Mount Sinai, when we heard Yahweh speak the 10 statements from the mountain, we couldn't hear anymore. We had to stand afar back, and we said, we can't handle this. Moses, you go for us, okay? You go, hear what Yahweh says, come back, tell us, and then we'll keep it, we'll obey it. And we see that in Deuteronomy 18, Yahweh said that it's good what they spoke, that they shouldn't hear my voice anymore lest they die. And so the solution is not Moses, but Yahweh said the solution is I'm going to send them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their brethren. And I'm going to put my own words in his mouth. He's going to speak everything I tell him to speak. And whoever doesn't hear his words is going to be accountable to me, is going to have to answer to me. We looked in the New Testament. We saw that Yeshua fits that description, that Yeshua indeed was the prophet. And he says, when you hear the words that I speak in my Father's name, then out of you, out of your heart will flow rivers of living water, speaking of the Spirit. And the people said, this surely is the prophet that Moses spoke of. And when we look at the new covenant, we see it in Jeremiah 31, quoted in Hebrews chapter 8, that the new covenant is him writing the Torah on our hearts and on our minds, and that the problem with the old covenant wasn't the Torah, it was on our part, not on God's part. Yahweh didn't lower his standards. Instead, he brought us up by renewing our hearts. And we saw that in Ezekiel chapter 36, he says, I will put my spirit within you to cause you to walk in my decrees, in my laws, and my statutes, and to do them. And so we know that the difference between the old and the new covenant is him renewing our hearts and him putting his spirit within us to truly live the Torah-observant lifestyle. That the Torah, the same Torah we have at Mount Sinai, is the same Torah we have with Yeshua and in the new covenant. And so today we're going to continue on the fruits of the Spirit, and we're going to talk about joy, which I'm excited about because that's a topic I love. I don't know about you, but I get excited about keeping the Torah. I get excited about serving Yeshua. especially during Shabbat, especially during the different holy times throughout the year, and especially as we come up, at least as we're filming this, I don't know when you're watching, but as we come up here closely to Sukkot, that's exciting. Sukkot's exciting. I love Sukkot. I love serving God. I love the Torah. And it's something we can get excited, something we can get joyful about. So let's look at joy, how joy is one of the fruits of the Spirit, and evidence that the Spirit of Yahweh truly is living inside us. That's why we're looking at the fruits of the Spirit. So we can really test ourselves and ask, are we living with the Spirit of Yahweh in us as we keep Torah, as we walk this out? So joy is one of the evidences. So let's look at joy. In Galatians, and chapter 5, he says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, long-suffering, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And so he says one of the fruits is joy. The word there he uses for joy is in the Greek chara, and I don't know if I'm quite pronouncing that correctly, but chara. And so when we look at the Hebrew equivalent of that word, we have a few words, that are used when we look at the Septuagint along with this word. We have simcha, which is the primary word we're going to be looking at today. Everyone say simcha. We have sason, another word that means joy or gladness. And we have rina. But we're going to be looking primarily at simcha, since that's the one most commonly used, and that's the one that really means to be joyful and to rejoice. So let's look at joy in the Torah. Because, a lot of times we might hear these subjects and these topics and say, man, this is churchy stuff. This is what we heard in the church. This is Christian-y stuff. I want the meat, right? I want the Torah. I want the commandments. So where do we find joy in the Torah? Did you know that we're actually commanded to rejoice, to be joyful in the Torah 10 times? 10 times Yahweh commands us to be joyful, to rejoice. How many times does he command the Sabbath? How many times, does he command the dietary laws? But yet he commands us to rejoice and to be joyful 10 times. And so we're going to take a look at those. 6 of them are in regards to tithes and offerings and going up to the temple. 1 of them is regarding Shavuot, and 3 of them are regarding the Feast of Sukkot. So let's take a look at the commandment to rejoice and why he gives us this commandment. The first instance is in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 7. And it says this, and there you shall eat before Yahweh your God, and you shall rejoice in all that you have put, in all that which you have put your hand, you and your households, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. And so we see here he says, when you come to the temple, when your fields have brought forth its crop and you've succeeded in your flocks, and you bring the best and the first to me, to my temple, and you come and you're thankful that I've provided for you, rejoice. Be joyful, be glad that I'm Yahweh your God, that I have blessed you in the produce of your field. We see it again in Deuteronomy 12:12. It says, and you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God, you and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gate, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. So once again, when we come, we rejoice. We're glad when we come to the house of God. We're glad when we come and bring our offerings. How many of you experience that when you come and you give and you bring, of your blessings to the different feasts? It's a time of rejoicing, and I'm looking forward to the day where we can once again go up to the house of God, to the temple, with Yeshua there as King, and bring what he's blessed us with and rejoice in him. We see the commandment again, Deuteronomy 12:18. And it says, but you must eat them, speaking about, our firstborn of the flocks and the tithes. You must eat them before Yahweh your God in the place which Yahweh your God chooses, which we know to be Jerusalem. You, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite who is within your gates. And you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God in all that which you have, your hands have produced, of all which you have put your hands, your crops and whatnot. We see it again in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 26. And you shall spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or strong drink, whatever your heart desires. You shall eat there before Yahweh your God, and you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God. We see it again in Deuteronomy chapter 26:11. So you shall rejoice in every good thing which Yahweh your God has given to you, you and your house, you and the Levite and the stranger, who is among you. So constantly, we've read 5 times already where we are commanded in the Torah to rejoice. All of them being from Deuteronomy so far. The next one's in Deuteronomy 27:7. And look what it says. You shall offer peace offerings and eat there and rejoice before Yahweh your God. It's a commandment. Also in Deuteronomy 16:11, we see the command. And it says, you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God. You, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger, and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, at the place that Yahweh your God chooses to make his name abide there. Once again, speaking of Jerusalem. And in Deuteronomy 16, verses 14 through 15, we have the commandment twice. Speaking of the feast, he said, and you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates. 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to Yahweh your God in the place which Yahweh chooses, because Yahweh your God will bless you in all your produce and in the work of your hands, so that you shall surely rejoice. And then finally, the last one is actually in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23 and verse 40, where it says, and you shall take for yourselves on the first day of the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God for 7 days. So we see 10 times in the Torah we're commanded to rejoice. But what do all these commandments to rejoice have in common? Well, they all deal with going to the temple, whether it's for the feast, whether it's bringing your tithes, offerings, taking care of the homeless or the widow. They all deal with celebrating that Yahweh is with us, that Yahweh is our provider, that he's blessed our fields, our crops, and they all deal with us being close and coming close to him, being in his presence, being at his house, being at his temple. And so it's truly the presence of God being with him that should make us rejoice and be glad to keep his Torah. Torah should be something that excites us. Living a life after Messiah Yeshua, following his example, should be something that makes us joyful. Did you know that part of our punishment and exile was actually for not rejoicing? You know, we talk about the various punishments for not keeping the commandments of God, but part of it was a punishment for not rejoicing in Yahweh our God, not being joyful in serving him. And we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 45 through 51. And let's read what it says about our exile and our punishment. He says, moreover, all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of Yahweh your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded you. And they shall be upon you for a sign and a wonder, and on your descendants forever. And then look at verse 47. Because you did not serve Yahweh your God with joy and gladness of heart for the abundance of everything. So he says the curses of the Torah come upon us because we didn't serve him from the joy and the gladness of our heart. We took it routinely. We made it a checklist. And we didn't rejoice and take joy in serving our Father. And so he says, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom Yahweh your God will send against you in hunger and thirst and nakedness. They're going to come in, take you captive, not respect. And we see all the curses and eventually leading into being taken captive into exile. And so when we didn't keep the commandment to rejoice, we were punished, and it's part of the reason for our exile. Now, we see a few good examples in the Tanakh of people rejoicing in Yahweh their God and being in his presence and surrounded, being near to him. The first example we have is of King David rejoicing. King David was a man who the scriptures say was after Yahweh's own heart, after God's heart. And he took joy and rejoicing of writing songs and praising him and singing his praises. But we see a beautiful example in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 15. And verses 1 through 3 sets the context. It says, David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. And David said, no one may carry the ark of God but the Levites, for Yahweh has chosen them to carry the ark of God and to minister before him forever. And David gathered all the people together in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of Yahweh to its place which he had prepared for it. So the context, the theme is that King David had prepared a place for the presence of God to dwell finally, to rest his name in Jerusalem. And look what happens. We're going to skip forward to verse 25. So David, the elders of Israel, and the captains over thousands went up to bring the ark of the covenant of Yahweh from the house of Obed-Edom with joy. And we see that they sang songs, they played music, they had trumpets, everyone was dancing. King David was dancing and just in full joy because Yahweh's presence had made its way to Jerusalem. His throne was finally being established there. And so they took joy in the presence of God. Next example we see is of King Hezekiah. And we go to the book of 2 Chronicles in chapter 30. And the context is they are celebrating the Passover for the first time in a long time, the way Yahweh had commanded them to. And King Hezekiah sends out messengers to gather the people and say, from all the different tribes, come and we're going to celebrate the Passover together once again as a united nation. And we see in verse 21 that it says this, 2 Chronicles 30:21. So the children of Israel who were present at Jerusalem kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with great gladness. And the Levites and the priests praised Yahweh day by day, singing to Yahweh, accompanied by loud instruments. And we see that they're keeping it with gladness and joy. And when we skip down to verse 26, it says, so there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. After King Solomon, when Israel was divided and we had the nation of Israel, nation of Judah, Israel went off and worshiped their own gods. But for the first time in a long time, they were coming together united from the various tribes to celebrate Passover. And what is Passover all about? Yahweh bringing them out of Egypt and to himself. And the joy of being in his presence, the joy of him taking us out from the nations so that we can be with him. Then the priests, the Levites, arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came up to his holy dwelling place, to heaven. So Yahweh heard their rejoicing, Yahweh heard their prayer, and it came to his throne in the heavens. And then the next and last example we're going to look at is in the book of Ezra in chapter 3. Where we see that they are laying the foundations of the temple once again after they're coming back from the Babylonian exile, and they're going to rebuild the temple, the house of God. And we see that they're laying the foundation. And in verse 11, Ezra 3, verse 11, and they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to Yahweh, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever toward Israel. And then all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised Yahweh, because the foundations of the house of Yahweh was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and the heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, people who had been there before the exile and had seen the temple of God, they wept with a loud voice when the foundation of the temple was laid before their eyes. I mean, could you imagine living in a time where you saw the prosperity, the blessing of Israel, but then you were carried away into captivity, and now 70 years later as you're coming back and from exile, just like it was prophesied, and you're seeing Yahweh's house being built once again. The tears, the joy, that must have been so overwhelming to them. And so we see, but many of the priests and Levites, they wept, yet many shouted aloud for joy. And we see in verse 13, so that the people could not discern between the shout of joy and the weeping that they heard. And the people shouted with a loud shout, and the shout was heard from afar off. And so they were joyful. Why? Because they were rebuilding the house of Yahweh, our God. And so we see all the context of these different joy, whether it's in the Torah, the commandment 10 times to rejoice, whether it's with David or Hezekiah or in the book of Ezra. It all relates to coming together and being in the presence of Yahweh, our God. Being in the presence of him should truly bring us joy. And we see this in the Psalm 16, verse 11. It says this, listen to how beautiful this is. You will show me the path of life, and in your presence is the fullness of joy. In his presence is the fullness of joy. And so it makes sense that when we're in the promised land and we're bringing these things to the house of God, we should be joyful and we should rejoice. So how does this relate to us today? Because most of you watching probably aren't living in the land of Israel. None of us have seen the temple of God. None of us have been able to go up and bring our offerings, our tithes to his house. None of us have been able to do really any of these things we're talking about, bringing the ark up to Jerusalem. So what's the reason we rejoice? Why should we be so happy if we're not in his presence, if we're not yet in the kingdom? Well, I believe it's because of the new covenant in Yeshua and the promise and the hope that we have that we will be in the kingdom, that we will be in the resurrection, that we are going to live in a time, whether he comes in our lifetime or not, eventually in the resurrection, we're going to be in a time where we dwell in his presence forever, and there's no more separation in this world. We get to see him face to face. We get to be with our King. We see in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19, Paul teaches this, or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you? He says, the Spirit of God really dwells in you, and you are a dwelling place for his Spirit. Obviously, that doesn't eliminate the need for the first temple and the hope we have for him dwelling with us again, but his Spirit does live within us. And we saw in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Yeshua saying that in this new covenant, in following Yeshua, we have the Spirit of God that lives in us. And so if his presence is among us, shouldn't that cause us to rejoice? Shouldn't that cause us to be joyful and excited when we keep his commandments? Instead of looking like, we just got our face sucked through a pipe, as my grandma would say. Sometimes you see people who have the truth of the Torah, they look so miserable, they look so sad, they look like, life couldn't be any worse. When in reality, living life in service to our King is the most exciting thing, is the most joyful thing to rejoice in, to take pleasure in. We see in Matthew chapter 13, and we look at verses 44 through 46, Yeshua tells us about the reason to rejoice in the greatness of his kingdom. And in Matthew chapter 13, it says this, and Yeshua's teaching, remember Yeshua being the greatest Torah teacher, and he says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid, and for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who when he had found one pearl of great price, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Yeshua said the truth of the kingdom of God, the truth of the kingdom of heaven is so beautiful, so great, that it's like a great treasure where you can sell everything else that you have and go and buy that field. How many of you, when you came into the knowledge of the feasts or the Shabbats or the truth, you went and bought, a plethora, a whole new library of books. You bought materials for all the feasts. You gave up your time. You spend late nights studying the scripture, learning his truth. And you rejoiced. You got excited. You put some time. You put some effort. You put some energy into learning how to serve him, into learning, how to follow him, because it truly is something to rejoice over. We have so many prophecies about in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah about this end times, about this last generation when in the exile, once God has spread his children into all the nations of the earth, and all these things have come upon us, that eventually there's going to come a day when we're going to wake up no matter where we are around the world, no matter what country we're living in. And he says he's going to bring our hearts back to him. And we're going to wake up and we're going to start serving him again. We're going to start keeping his commandments. We're going to start walking in his ways, in his Torah, in his truth. And guess what? We're living in that time. We're living in the fulfillment of that prophecy. If you haven't realized that yet, wake up and realize that. That's exciting. We're living in the time that Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel prophesied about. And there's people all around the world, you who are viewing here on the Hebraic Roots Network or others around the world, are waking up to the truth of his Torah. People are coming back and wanting to follow him, wanting to keep his commandments. And it's amazing some of the testimonies you hear about people coming into it, whether it was through prayer, it was through fasting, people had woken up to the Shabbat or to the feast and started walking in his ways, but we're seeing a fulfillment of all that prophecy. And what that allows us to know is that the restoration of all things, the time of that is near. The spirit of Elijah, that's here, that's coming. His return, that's going to be soon. His kingdom, that's something we get to look forward to and to participate in. And if that doesn't make you rejoice, if that doesn't make you excited, I don't know what possibly could. And so we look at a verse from Philippians 4:4 as our last verse. It says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I will say, rejoice." Because living a life for Him is truly something to be joyful in. You can find more information on my website at loveforyeshua.com. And please join us for the rest of this series as we discuss the fruits of the Spirit, the various fruits: love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Because as we come to these last days and as we look forward to His kingdom, we should examine our hearts, examine ourselves, and make sure that His Spirit is truly dwelling with us, that we're not just living the commandments in the letter, but also in the Spirit. And these fruits in our lives are the evidence that the Spirit of Yahweh is dwelling inside us according to the new covenant, that we are keeping His Torah in both the Spirit and the letter. Because remember, when we keep it in just the letter, when we just take it as a checklist, things to do throughout our day, the do's and don'ts, there's a lot of times where we can really manipulate that. There's a lot of times where we can find loopholes to get around certain commandments and really ease it to us. But when we come at it with the attitude of waking up every day and saying, "Father, how can I serve you? How can I live according to your Torah? How can I fulfill the true heart and meaning behind each and every one of these commandments?" And you allow the Spirit to guide you in your keeping of the commandments, in your Torah observant walk. That's truly the best way to do it. That's truly the best way to live. To walk with Him, to hear directly from Him. And remember, that's what Yeshua really came teaching. We see that, like on the Sermon on the Mount, when He really extends the commandments. He says, you've heard it said, don't murder. I tell you, don't even hate, don't even be angry in your heart against your brother. Don't even harvest any sort of a grudge against your neighbor. And saying things like, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery. I tell you, don't even let your eyes wander. Don't even lust. Don't even think about it. Yeshua came bringing the Torah to a whole new level. Not just looking at the outside, but looking at the inside. Because remember, when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, the things that tripped them up the most weren't the commandments on the outside. It wasn't their tzitzit. It wasn't their, eating kosher or not kosher. What tripped the Israelites up were always the spirit, always the heart issue. Whether it was fear, not wanting to go into the land, doubting God's ability to dispossess the nations that were inhabiting the land. Whether it was putting themselves over their community, not being selfless with the manna and the water, and worrying, saying, hey, I wish we could eat this. I wish we could go back to Egypt, Moses. Why'd you take us from Egypt? Notice it was always the heart issues that the children of Israel struggled with, and that really got them in trouble. And as we saw in Deuteronomy, part of it was joy, not rejoicing in Him. So join us for the rest of this series as we talk about the fruits of the Spirit and see how we should see these in our walk, in our Torah-observant lifestyle, as the evidence of us being part of the new covenant, of the Torah in our hearts and the Spirit of Yahweh dwelling inside us. Thank you, and join us next time. Shalom.
Shalom, I'm Ryan White, and I'd like to invite you to join me on the Joshua Generation Show on Hebraic Roots Network. Help us spread the Word of God to all the nations. You can check us out on the schedule at HebraicRootsNetwork.com to see when our episodes are airing, or you can check us out on demand anytime on the web at HebraicRootsNetwork.com, or on your Roku device on your television. You can check us out as well on demand anytime from the comfort of your own living room. I hope to see you there.